So what you'll see here is an animated sequence running directly in the My viewport, and this is actually kind of the end goal of what we'll be showing in the demonstration, what we'll be working towards. So we're obviously going to be talking a lot about Maya, but we'll also be talking about quite a few of the other ancillary products that are associated with the Maya Entertainment Creation Suite, and talk about how those can benefit your workflow and kind of add capabilities to the existing Maya toolset. We're going to start in Maya, where we'll talk about some polymodeling and UV editing before we send this mesh off to Mudbox for some detailed refinement. So to begin with, what we want to do is add a couple of meshes to this. You can see our character's been modeled out to a certain extent. He's actually missing some eyeballs, so I'm actually going to use some polycreate tool to go in and just quickly create a polygon sphere, which I can then basically scale up and then kind of snap into place right into the eye socket. Now let's frame into that, and we'll begin to refine not only the size and position, but also the orientation. So I'll just use my rotation tool to snap that into place so that it's facing forward. And then I'll just kind of place that in the eye socket until I get it positioned appropriately and how I want it. So let's say that's pretty good. And now we'll actually go in and copy this over to the other side. Now, if I create a copy of this, I can actually just drag that over to the other side. But if I want to ensure that it's in the exact same spot, what I can do is I can just take the X value, which is our left to right axis, and I can just add a negative to that so that it'll basically mirror over to the exact opposite side. Now I'm guaranteed that both sides will line up. So from here, I want to go in and actually refine the existing mesh. Now, this has obviously been modeled out, but if I wanted to begin to refine this, I can use some of my polygon modeling tools to go in and, for instance, add something like an edge loop or insert that along an existing path where I can just simply click, drag, and drop a series of detail on my existing mesh. Now I can go in and I can use something like my slide edge tool to reposition that along the existing edges, or just by using a hotkey I can expand that or contract that to basically create kind of an implied volume for that fin area. Now, other things that I can do, I can go in and I can use things like soft selection, where I can actually grab a vertice, and you can see by grabbing a vertice by itself, it's actually going to only affect that vertice. Now, if I turn on my soft selection and scale up my volume, you can see that I can actually get a soft fall off around that vertice. And then if I were to go in and simply turn on reflection, you can see that will actually mirror over across the character, allowing me to grab individual vertices and then edit those and then mirror that across the other side of the character with the soft fall off. Now I can also do this on the object level. So if I just switch over into object mode with this eyeball and I go into my soft selection settings, you can see here that right now if I move this eyeball, it's kind of independent of the object. However, if I turn on soft selection and I go into a global mode, what you can see is now I'll get a fall off over the rest of my character. So now as I move that eyeball, it's affecting the entire head. So I'm going to scale that effect down, and the other thing I want to do is grab the other eyeball and I'll switch into a scale mode. Now you can see that I can scale those eyeballs and actually affect the shape of the head. Now I don't want to affect the teeth, so I can actually go into my layers. I've got my layers set up to actually associate with the teeth so that I can actually either hide them, or I can go in and I can template them or reference them. And now when I go back into the tool, I just simply reselect these. You can see that by referencing those teeth out, now they're no longer going to be affected by the scale and the soft fall off related to the scale. So there's a variety of lower level poly modeling tools that we can use in Maya to create some really kind of nice modeling effects. So let's move on and we'll talk now about how to actually associate materials and textures. So in Maya, we would use the hypershade, which basically gives us a library of different types of materials and textures that we can associate with our object. So I'll start by creating, let's say I want to create kind of a shiny skin. So I'll create a blend, which is a shinier material, and I'll basically drag and drop that right onto my character's body. I'll go into the attribute editor for the blend node, and now I'll just simply use my color picker to go in and grab a color and basically kind of refine that color. I'm going to add kind of a lightish green to this, which will eventually become the base for an existing texture. So kind of a green yellow, there we go. So let's go in and we'll do the same thing with the eyes. So I'll just switch back over into my hypershade, and you can see here I've already got a material associated with the teeth. Let's also go in and grab this material for the eye and just drag and drop that onto the eyeballs. Now, I can actually paint textures directly in Mudbox, or if I want, if I have an existing texture, I can actually go in and I can assign that directly in Maya. So let's just graph the material for the eye there, and I'll just scroll down here into my node list, and I'll grab a file texture node, drag that onto the color. So actually, I kind of missed that. Let's pull that back a little bit. Let's drag that onto the color of my material. And now you can see that I basically had a material with a file feeding into it. Now that file node is empty right now, so I'll just double click on that file node, bringing up the attribute editor for the file node. And now I can go to my file browser and begin to look for the things that I'm concerned with. So let's actually go into my folder here where I've got my demo files, and under my source images I've got a variety of textures, and you can see I can click on any one of these textures to show the swatch on the right hand side. I'm actually looking for a couple of different eye textures. So let's see, there's eyes reptile and there's another eye there. I'll choose eye reptile. I'll open that. That will automatically get associated with my eyes. Now the next thing I want to do is actually create some UVs for this. So you can see here that the eye texture doesn't quite line up with the eyeball appropriately. So I'm going to go into my UV editor, and I'm just going to quickly go in and create some new UVs for this. So what's happening here is I'm using the default UVs for a sphere, which don't really work with this texture. So I'm just going to go into my marking menus, and under mapping, I'll use a planar map along the front axis, which in this case would be looks like it's the Z axis. And that will basically align the texture more appropriately with the shape of the eyeball. Now I can go in and I can use my 3D and 2D manipulators to begin to scale that texture relative to the eyeball. I can also go in and I can begin to do things like a rotation relative to the eyeball. And I can work in either 2D or 3D mode. And now the next thing I want to do is actually take any edits that I've just made, and I want to share that with the other eyeball. And rather than having to do it twice, what I want to do is simply copy the attributes from this eyeball to this eyeball. So I'll select one eyeball, shift select the next. I'll go under my mesh settings here, and I want to do a transfer attributes. Now with the transfer attribute tools, I can transfer a variety of different kinds of data. What I want to actually do is transfer my UV sets. I want to transfer them in local space relative to each eyeball. And then I also want to turn on my mirroring across the x-axis. So I'm actually going to mirror in the same way that I mirror the position, I'm going to mirror the UVs across that axis. So I simply do a transfer. And now with one simple click, I've got the exact same UV layout, except for the fact that it's actually mirrored appropriately for the opposite eye. So ultimately, what I want to do is take all of this and refine it even further using the tools that are available to me in Mudbox. Now, one thing that's new in Maya 2011 and Mudbox 2011 is the ability to take all of this. Actually, let me go in and unreference my teeth so I can select those. I can take all of this and I can export this directly to Mudbox with a single click. So I simply go under File, and there is an Export Selected to Mudbox option now. I just simply select that. That'll take that mesh and it will send it to Mudbox. Now if I switch over into Mudbox, what you'll see is the mesh has been directly imported into Mudbox without me ever having to really deal with the file browser. So with one simple click, I was able to transfer everything that I was working on in Maya, including the mesh as well as the shaders and textures, and have that as my starting point in Mudbox. So now that we've got our character in Mudbox, we want to begin to refine the form, add details to the mesh, and also paint some textures. So first thing I want to do is actually start to add a little bit of form to my character. So Mudbox is a high-res modeling, sculpting, and painting tool. And it's a non-destructive workflow so that as I'm working on an object, I can create layers to store all the modeling operations that I do. So I'm going to create a layer here, and using my sculpt brush, I'm just going to go in and scale my brush up a bit, and I'm going to edit the magnitude to bring that down a little bit, and I'm going to start to sculpt on my character. And what you'll notice is as I sculpt, I get kind of a really faceted look. So I need to go up to a higher level of detail. So I just simply hit a hotkey and I can begin to increase the resolution of my mesh. So by the time I get up to R3 or actually level 4, I get up to about 1 million polygons, and this is going to give me a lot more surface area, a lot more surface detail rather to work with. So I'm going to turn off my wireframe and I'm going to create a new layer this time, and now I'm going to go in and begin to sculpt out kind of some muscular detail for the chest area. I'm not going to be too much concerned with the actual kind of finished result right now because I'm just going to kind of rough it out initially, and then I'll use my Shift hotkey to kind of begin to blend in some of the effects as I paint them. So another thing I might want to do is start to add a little bit of kind of muscular detail as well, or kind of bone and ligament rather. So you can see that here this layer actually has all the edits that I've made, but I want to take that a little further and add some areas of detail around kind of the rib cage here. So I'll just begin to scale my brush down and decrease the strength of that brush, and just kind of loosely, that's a little bit too much. Let's increase my brush size there a little bit. And begin to kind of paint in just kind of some really loose area, really loose kind of definition for the rib cage there. Again, I'm not worried too much about the finer details at this point. I'm just creating kind of general form and general shape. So I'm going to create some kind of ligaments here along the neckline. And now what I want to do is start to use Shift again to just simply blend that down to the underlying mesh. So I can go in and I can get rid of any kind of creases or folds that I may have created, or get rid of any kind of artifacts that I may have created. So now I'll start to fade in kind of this rib cage area, kind of blend that in, and then here at the end I'll kind of start to taper that in as well, just so I leave a little bit of definition, but that it's not too stark. So all of that is built into a single layer, so you can see that if I don't like it, I can just get rid of the layer, or I can take the layer itself and I can actually blend that down so that I get a partial effect of the layer. So it's very handy and very flexible. So let's move on and talk about actually painting some higher details. So for this, I'm actually going to go up one more level of detail and create one more subdivision level of about 4 million polygons. So it'll take a little while to generate the first time. Once it does, it'll be actually quite quick. So now I'm up to 4.6 million polygons, and we're going to go around the back side here, and we're going to start to create some details using things called stamps and stencils, which are basically masks that affect the behavior of your brush. So I can use any of the presets that are made available to me here in either the stamp or stencils, or I can go to my image browser and I can actually load up custom bitmaps that will affect my brush. So here you see I have a bunch of different scales that have been created in other applications such as Photoshop maybe, and I want to take these and essentially load those into the stencil on my brush. So now when I go in and start to project this onto my object, first of all I need a new layer to work on, so I create a new layer, scale my brush up a little bit, and now I start to stamp this on, and you can see I'm creating a pattern based on that stroke. I actually want to change this a little bit by adding a little bit of stamp spacing, which will basically give me alter the frequency of the stamps across the brush. Now I'm going to scale that up a little bit, add a little bit more strength, and now begin to paint those once more. So let's actually get a nice big brush there. Now you can see the scale pattern getting stamped on across the ridge of the back there. So I might want to come in here and I might want to stamp some scales up along the arm and around the neck area, and perhaps over the chest and up in through the neck and so on. And as I'm doing this, I can also go in and just use my Shift key to kind of blend in certain areas where I might have some overlap and I want to kind of fade that in. So really quickly and easily I can begin to go in and get a significant amount of detail. And again, this is dealing with a mesh that's about 6 million polys. So the last thing I want to show here is the ability to use stencils. Stencils basically work, instead of from the point of view of the brush, they actually work from the point of view of the screen essentially. So relative to the model here, I can basically go in and I can create a texture, and then I can begin to stamp that, or rather stencil that directly into my object if I wanted to create some kind of a pattern of detail. So another way that I can use this though is with something called vector displacement maps. And vector displacement maps are a unique way of representing a form in a 2D manner. So what I have here is basically just kind of a visual guide for what my vector displacement is going to look like. This is actually going to create kind of a horn structure. And if I just loosely place this kind of on the back of my elbow here, and then go back into my sculpt brush, one thing I want to do is make sure I have maximum strength, and I want to make sure that I have maximum buildup, because I would just want to quickly go in here and just do a quick projection of the entire shape. Actually, that's a little bit too large. Let me scale my brush down a little bit there. And actually, I want to scale my stencil down is what I really want to do. So let's scale that down a little bit more there. And now I can begin to project that on. There we go. So that's basically projecting from the point of view of the camera. As I move that around, you'll see that I actually have a significant amount of detail in this. If I were to create another one here on the shoulder and actually bump that up a little bit, what you can see is that as I'm projecting that on, I'm actually getting a lot of curvature in the actual brush, so, or rather in the actual deformation. So let's just quickly, oh, I'm only at 30%, that's why. Let's undo that and I'll redo it at 100% so that I can see the actual full effect. So let's do that at 100%, and there we go. Now you're actually seeing the full effect of that horn, and you're seeing the curvature of the brush as well, or rather the curvature of the vector displacement. So it stores vector information in with the image so that it knows not only to extrude it out, but also to curve it along a specific path. So let's move on and we'll talk a little bit about some of the other stuff that can be done in Mudbox. But in order to do that, I'm going to bring up a file that already has some details in it. So let's just quickly switch over to another file. So here you see kind of the final version of our character, and if I pull in here a little bit, you can see all the detail within the texture. You can see the vector displacement maps that were applied, but also you can see quite a bit of detail in the scales around the torso and around the head. If I were to actually go in and take a look at this layer, you can see here there's a layer that actually stores all the scale information for the upper body. And again, this is dealing with a mesh that is in the range of about 4.5 million polygons. So ultimately what I want to do is take all this and extract it into texture format. So I can take all the surface detail, and using my extract texture maps tool, I can go in and I can create a normal map, which basically allows me to sample the surface and create a 2D image that represents all of the kind of detail in the mesh. So rather than take the time to do that, I'll actually show kind of the finished result. And in order to do that, I'm actually going to page down to a lower level. I'm just using my page up and down keys to go down to the base level 0, which was the original mesh, as you can see. And I'm going to switch over into my texture paint section, and in here you'll see I have a normal map. If I turn that on, you can see that normal map gives me a significant amount of kind of visual detail in my object, but it's all represented in map form. It makes it look as though it actually contains the detail, but that was actually again extracted from the 4.5 million poly mesh and now applied to the moderately sized 10,000 poly mesh. So I can also do this in other forms. For instance, ambient occlusion. I can actually extract that same surface detail into the texture map as an ambient occlusion map, which will pick up the lights and darks of the shading of the model based on cracks and crevices and things of that nature. And ultimately I can comp all this together onto a texture that has been texture painted. So here you see a texture that's been texture painted, and then on top of that I want to basically go in and add another color map. So I'm going to switch over and add a color map just so I can show a couple of examples for texture painting. Let's go into our paint tools and I'll grab my paintbrush. And for the paintbrush, I'll load a stamp in, and I'll just choose kind of a blood red color here, and I'll begin to stamp that directly into my texture area. So actually, let's bring up the strength of that and scale up my brush, and now you can start to see that kind of vein pattern stamped onto a layer, just as though I would, just in the same way that I would create a layer in Photoshop. So you can see that vein pattern is now stored in a layer. Then I can go in and I can use other tools such as hue shift, for example, where I can go in and I can set a value along the color wheel and I can begin to shift that to another color. So if I wanted it to be more of an orange, or if I wanted to actually replace this, for instance, with a blue color, I can go in and I can set my color to be blue, and then I can basically start to replace all that red with blue veins instead of red veins if I want to. So there's a variety of paint tools available to you. We don't have time to go into them all, but hopefully that makes sense. And then of course I still have my ambient occlusion layer, which I can just drag right on top, and then I can basically superimpose that onto my other two paint layers. And I can also turn on something like the normal map layer. And then lastly, I can also paint directly on things like specularity. So I can have a specular map, I can have an incandescence map, all come together onto the same object. So ultimately what I want to do is take all this and send it back to Maya. So I'm going to take my mesh and I'm just going to simply send this to Maya, and it'll give me a few options here. I want to flatten the paint layers, and I also want to flatten the sculpt layers so that I get a single mesh in Maya when I send this across. So here we are back in Maya with the object that I was just working with in Mudbox. And as you can see, if I turn on the textures, all the texture information that was created in Mudbox is there. And additionally, if I were to switch over into a high quality mode, the normal map as well has been transferred over. So that'll take a couple of seconds to refresh, but there you can see the normal map that also gets passed over. So basically all the surface editing as well as any of the texture maps that I've created will get passed back, and now I can take this character and begin to animate it and integrate it into other scenes.